Okay, so the pattern I'm going to tie is not this one because I did this one, as I was saying earlier, backwards. It's a dragonfly nymph that's supposed to be fat at the back and narrow at the front, and I put the body on wrong. So what it actually looks like is this, if you're looking from the top. It's broader at the back than it is at the front. It's got some legs and a pair of eyes. I've done it in a couple of different colors. You can do it in dark olive, light olive, brown if you want, depending on the kind of weeds you have. What is the beauty of this pattern, and this is a pattern that was developed by Ian Denny, the son of the guy that used to own Denny's Fly Tying Specialties in Edmonton. And it's designed to fish a dragonfly nymph right near the bottom, preferably just above the weed beds. So the idea is that the body of the pattern is slightly buoyant, and you fish it on a sinking line, like a type 3 sink with a short leader, like maybe 6 feet, and a bit of tippet. And you let the line goes down and it sits on top of the weed beds. And then as you troll or strip it back, the dragonfly imitation sits just above the weeds. So it doesn't get hung up. And that's where the dragonflies like to live. So to make the body slightly buoyant, you build it with...
This is for anything like bass, trout.
Yep. Anything that feeds on dragonfly larvae. Or anyway. So to make the body slightly buoyant, the original pattern is this. The underbody uses these things, which is these pointy toothpicks. And so what you do is you end up cutting a piece of this toothpick off of the proper length, and you point the thick part of the toothpick at the back of the fly and the point up towards the waist of the fly. It's a little bit tricky to get those to adhere to the hook, but I'll show you how to do that. You have to cut them. The other thing that I've done is I've done one that uses closed cell foam and put that onto the hook. You have to be really careful because you don't want to crush the foam. It loses its buoyancy if you do. So you have to use a very light thread pressure when you're wrapping it on, and you have to cut it to shape. So here's the base of the closed cell foam. And this is a little thicker than mostly what I use, a little wider, I should say. It's 2 mil. The other piece is a little bit thinner. And if you're cutting them out of sheet of foam, you're better off to cut one like that that's about the width of the gap of the hook. And then what you do is you cut it to a shape like a coffin. It's got a thicker and wider at the back and skinnier at the front. I'll show you that when we get there. The hook, I'm using a 3X long size 6. You can tie this on a size 8 for a little more delicate hook, but you want to have it long enough. So if you use a size 8, I'd use a 4X. This is a 3X. It's a TMCO 5263. So it's a heavy wire hook with about 3X long. So we'll start it off with some 6/0 thread, and right behind the eye of the hook to begin with. And I'm keeping, as I said, a very light thread pressure. So I've got the spool quite loose. And with the spool quite loose, if I hold the tag of the thread up like that, and my vise is wiggling around here, make sure that's good and snug. If you hold the thread up at an angle like that, every time your thread, because the thread pressure is light, every time you wrap over the thread, it forces the wraps down right next to each other along the hook shank. So you can do this and get a nice, fairly nice even thread wrap down the hook shank. And you want to dress this because if you get a good dressed shank, it makes it easier to attach these little bits of toothpick to the hook shank. So once I'm back there, I'm going to bring the thread back up in nice tight wraps, close to each other, all the way back up the hook shank to create that thread base. And I'm going to stop about at a third of the way up the hook shank. So I'm leaving a good gap at the front. Now this is where I figure out how long I need the body to be. I'll measure from where the thread is hanging, the tip of this pointy toothpick, back to where the barb used to be. And I pinch that with my fingernails and take my scissors at a, get you here, at about a 45-degree angle right there, and cut through. I got to hold it so it doesn't spring all over that place. So I end up with a piece of toothpick that has this little angle at the back. To help it adhere to the hook, I'm going to take my pliers, and it's the pointy part, the longer part of this toothpick that's going to be up against the hook shank. So I'm going to hold that, and I'm just going to, right across that 45, I'm going to give it just a little pinch with my pliers to flatten it just a little bit. I'm going to make another one from the other end of the toothpick. It's basically the same length. And I might have to snip it twice if I don't get the length quite right, but I'll just measure it here and cut it. The other one, the same sort of length. And I'll compare the two to see if the lengths are the same. And by gum, they are. They're nice and even. I'm going to take the one that I just cut, and I'm going to flatten that as well. Just a teeny bit. That just gives a flat surface for the toothpick to adhere to the shank of the hook. Just pinch it just a little bit. All right. Now, super glue. You got to watch your fingers on this. Try not to get too much super glue on the hook shank. And you're going to try and keep your fingers away from the super glue once it's there. I'm going to just get the sides of the hook with the just a touch of brushable super glue. And then I'm going to hold this by the butt end with the tip pointing forward and the long part of that 45-degree at the back. I'm going to hold that up against the hook shank right where my thread is, and gently wrap the thread around the tip.
I was wondering if any of you fellas have seen the man Snoopy.
So now you see I've got the tip on, and I will push towards me. I'm going to push that toothpick up against the shank where the super glue is. And that will bind it to the shank. And when I'm wrapping over top of this, I want to try and make sure that the toothpick is on the side of the hook. When I get it all the way back to the back, you'll see I still have a bit of a gap at the back there. I'm going to bring my thread back up to where I was before, and I'm going to just touch up the near side of the hook with the super glue as well. And take the other piece of toothpick and do the same thing again with the long pointy bit of the 45-degree cut facing the shank. Squeeze it up against the super glue and then wrap gently over top. And then back up to the front. Now you see I've got that on either side of the hook with the wide part at the back and the narrow part at the front. It's not a thing of beauty, but it's fine. And if you need to, sometimes they'll wrap a bit around the shank. So I, again, just take my pliers and just make sure they're square to the shank, right angles to the shank, and make sure that they're nice and flattish. Now, the next thing I need is eyes before I get going any further. So I have, for eyes on these guys, I have a medium-sized bead chain. And you can buy them in pairs on a extruded thing, but I've got a little bag of bead chain, plastic bead chain. And all I want to do is I want to take one pair off the end. Cut that off so it doesn't disappear onto the floor, which it did. And I'll hold this right where the thread is, halfway between the points of the toothpicks and the eye of the hook. I've got my thread hanging. I'm going to wrap 45 degrees over a couple of wraps. And then I'm going to square it up by wrapping the other way from front to back over the center of those eyes. Get them in, and they will tend to twist. So once again, my friend brushable super glue, and I'll just touch a little bit on the thread here and then give a couple of wraps. See, there's a little blob of super glue there. And that will go into that center part there. Bring forward. And at this point, I'm just going to whip finish it. Now, because these toothpicks can absorb water, you don't want them to, you want them to stay buoyant. I'll then take my head cement and I will coat the top and bottom of this toothpick body with some head cement. And this will tend to waterproof those things so they're not going to get waterlogged. Then I'll take that off the shank and put it aside to dry. So now we've got this one is one I prepared before, and it's nice and dry. So I can start working on one without getting glue on everything. And I'll do the same thing. I'll start just behind the eye of the hook and wrap back a bit. Trim the excess. Bring my thread right down over top of that and make a little bit of a thread ball right at the back of where those toothpicks are attached. This is where I'm going to attach the tail of this dragonfly larva or nymph. And what I'm using for the tail is peacock sword. See how this is the, not peacock curl, it's sword. It's the off sort of the end of the peacock quill. And it's really fuzzy at the ends and quite coarse in the material on the sides. I'm going to take my scissors and cut off 4 or 5 strands of this peacock eye. And this is a very short tail. So they're maybe a 1/4 inch or so long. And I'll bind the butts down just in behind the body. So you see they're just sticking out there at the back. And wrap the tips down, butts down, leave my thread hanging right where the barb used to be. So the next thing is the body, which is fine chenille. So this is, I'm going to use the light colored one so you can see it reasonably well. And before I tie this down, I want to pull the fuzz off the end of the chenille. So there's about 1/8 of an inch or so of thread showing through. And I'll lay that down right where the peacock sword is attached. Then I'll bring my thread forward out of the way and let it hang right behind the eyes of the body here, guys. And then make close wraps. And you have to be a little bit careful how you wrap these. You want them fairly tight together. You want to almost a little bit of overlap at the back, right close to being one on top of the other, but close enough that you can see that. I don't know if you can see in there, but the center core is dark in color, so that actually shows through. So you want to make these nice even wraps that give kind of a ribbed appearance to the body of the nymph. And you can wrap them so you see, as I do this, I'll turn this from time to time. You see how the body is tapered? That's because of the underbody. It gives it that tapered dragonfly nymph shape. And then when I get up to just behind the eyes, I will stop wrapping it and I will tie it down a couple of wraps behind, one in front. I'm not going to trim it off yet. I'm going to pull it forward. I'm going to get my thread in front. I'll put my thread in front right by the eye. I'll pull it forward in between the eyes and wrap down the far side, a couple of wraps. And I cut off about, leaving about an inch of peacock curl hanging out the front, because I'm going to use that later. Bring my thread back underneath the eyes, right in behind them, and make a wrap. Now I need legs. And for legs, the original pattern was to use a dyed green hen hackle. I don't have dyed green, but I have some nice hen hackles that are a little bit different colors. So I'm going to take this one that's a little bit lighter, because the body on this fly is a little lighter. For the darker ones, I would use this hen hackle. It's a little darker. And I will pull one of the ones off the tip. You see how the hen hackles are shorter fibers and finer at the butt end. And when you get up to this end, they're longer and more webby. And I want the ones off of the long webby end. I'm going to pull it out from the, and measure. I want the barbule length to be almost body length of the fly. So that looks like a decent one there. I'll pull that off the hen neck. So there's the hen hackle. Take it by the tip and stroke it backwards like that. And I will tie this in with the colored part of the hackle facing me, and with this little tip of the hackle facing forward. I'll tie that right in behind the eyes. A couple of good wraps behind to get that stem snugly down. One in front just to lock it in. And now snip out the tip. Take my hackle pliers, grab the stem, and now the trick is to wrap this around like we did with all our previous folded wet fly hackle techniques. Wet my fingers and stroke the barbules back, fold them around the stem a bit. And as I make the wrap around I want to keep this out of the way here. As I make my wrap around the body, I want to, every once in a while, stroke these hackle fibers back so they're all pointing to the back. And I want to make 3 wraps, at least 3. Keep out of the way of the thread. 2. 3. Stroke them all back. So all of the hackle fibers are towards the back of the fly. Bring my thread up over the top and tie it down. 1, 2, and then 1 in front. I get in here with my scissors and trim off that butt. 1 more good wrap. So now I'm going to bring my thread underneath the eyes again and wrap them around the eye of the hook a couple of times. Taking my hackle pliers again going to bring the chenille on the far side underneath the eyes and make a couple of wraps, certainly one wrap behind the eyes to force those legs towards the back. Bring it up and then over the top again and front of the eyes and tie it down. And pull it back and wrap in front. I will trim that out. Get there. Stroking all of the fibers back, I'll build just a teeny little head right behind the eye of the hook, and then we'll finish it off. Now at this point, you could super glue it down, or you could put a little lacquer on it. Doesn't matter, just as long as it's good and secure. Now I take all of these fibers that I put with the hen hackle that are pointing back. I want to kind of separate them out so that there's some on either side of the hook, approximately equal amount pulled out to either side of the hook. Take my scissors across the top and snip them ones off the top and the bottom. There's some mallards out here that got away from me. Then on the sides, I want to reduce the number of legs. So come from the bottom and split them out a few, snip those off. Same thing on the other side. Separate a few fibers out on the bottom and snip them off. And I'll do the same from the top. I'll just take a few fibers from the clumps on the side and trim a few of them out. Until I still want some somewhat substantial legs on either side so that you can see them. So the fish can see them mostly. And that's him.
That's a cool fly, Dave. I would imagine that's a really good dragonfly.
Yeah. Now, what I'm going to do before we're done here, I'm just going to show you.
You find that just the wood is buoyant enough, Dave?
Yes, it is. Because it gives bulk, right? You don't need it horribly buoyant, just enough to get it up above the weed bed. And again, if you have a lightweight leader, I wouldn't do any more than like 3x for a leader in 3x level. It will stay up. I'm just going to wrap this thread back to the back for the next one, which will be the one that uses the foam. So I'm again building this thread underbody. Bring the thread back up to that 1/3 point. And yeah. Let me just show you how I'm just going to do this bit here fairly quickly. So I'm going to measure this foam the length that I want.
Bunny. There's a bunny.
There's a bunny. Okay. So now I've got it cut to length to fit between where the thread is hanging and the bend of the hook. I'm going to cut the little just a couple of corners off to give it that slightly tapered back end. So there we go. We have that back end. And I'm going to cut a longer diagonal from a narrow point at the front. Swap it off that way. Do another one on the other side. So now I have that coffin-shaped piece of foam. And this time, because I don't not tying it to the sides of the hook, I'm tying it to the top. I'm going to put the super glue dab on the very top of the hook. This one's a little easier on your fingers because you just take the foam and put it down on top of the hook and then just press it down onto the super glue, and that will hold it in place temporarily. That'll hold it right there. Now again, I'm going to use very light wraps to wrap this down because, and only a few as I go down, because I don't want to crush the foam with the thread. When I get that done, I'll come right back up again with a fairly light thread wraps. So you see now there's crisscross thread over top of that foam. Once again, halfway up between the end of the foam and the eye to place my bead chain eyes. Make sure that foam is right on top. And I will wrap those on. Those diagonal wraps again. And just a touch of super glue on the thread. This is the stuff that I buy from Home Hardware for less than $10. That's super glue. And a few wraps in there with the super glue. A couple of wraps on the eye and tie it off. So, and when I've got that done, I'm going to, in order to stiffen that foam up so that it doesn't collapse when I'm wrapping the chenille over top later, I'll take my lacquer, just regular Sally Hansen's, and I'll lacquer that down, make sure it's on there good, both top and bottom. And then I'll let it dry. And so now you've seen how the body is prepped. I won't need to tie, and how they've done the fly body prop, the fly itself. I won't do another one. I'll stop there. It's just because you end up with this guy here that's the same shape as the toothpick one, but it's made out of foam. And I'll tie the rest of the fly the same way. Start with the peacock sword at the back, strip some off the end of the chenille, tie that at the back, wrap it over that form. Again, being careful not to squeeze too hard. You don't want to distort the shape. Tied off behind the eyes, through the eyes, just to cover pardon me, just to cover the tie-in point for the eyes. Leave the chenille hanging. Wrap your legs with a hen hackle. Bring the peacock curl back. Wrap it in behind the eyes, and then back over and in front. Tie it off, and then trim your legs. And that's him. That's the way she goes. Now I've got a couple of prepared bodies here that are drying that I will tie the bodies on later. So that is the Sulphur dragon, and it was originally designed for one of the lakes in northern Alberta called Sulphur Lake, but it works on any lake that has weed beds and dragonflies. And then I will de-highlight me. And leave it for Florin.
They're plastic eyes.
So that was a fun technique, something a little different.
Okay, thank you, Dave. I guess I moved my things here in the meantime, so I'll have to refocus. There you go. All right, so here's what we're gonna do now. This is really a variant to the very well-known Royal Wolf. That's not as gaudy, perhaps. You know, you don't get as much peacock curl, you don't get the red band, and you got to play more with calf hair. So both the tail and the wings are calf body hair, and the abdomen here is stripped peacock curl. So these are the interesting parts of this fly. Now what I like to do is I like to pre-tie tails and wings, and then have the bodies prepared for tying the fly. But I'm going to do one from start to finish. You can use super glue if you feel comfortable using that stuff, or you can just practice a little bit more, and it turns out that it is possible to get that calf hair to stay on the hook without the super glue. Some people talk about, you know, losing hair when they cast. I think that can be avoided with enough thread tension. So the usual thing, you bring the thread down to the point at the back of the hook where it's hanging down to where you crush the barb, and then you cut a little piece of a little clump of hair for the tails. Now this stuff here is calf body hair, which is a little bit shorter than tail, but is a little bit easier to work with. The other thing you want is, because this is relatively short hair, is you want a hair stacker that's not too big. So I have several hair stackers. This one has a sort of a very pronounced conical shape to the funnel, and that is much preferable to this hair stacker, where the diameter here is a lot larger. So for the amounts of hair that we're using here, if you have a hair stacker that can handle smaller amounts of hair, and it's a lot smaller than, you know, by comparison, these are the two hair stackers side by side. This one looks big, but because it has this conical shape, it's not so bad. So this one is also useful. So use whatever you have, but like I said, you might end up with a little bit of frustration if your hair stacker is too big. Now, in terms of cutting the correct amount of hair, well, that's something that you can only work out through a certain amount of practice. You know, a rule of thumb would be to go and get a clump of hair that, when compressed, is about, you know, between your fingers, is about the gap of the hook. That might give you a bit too fluffy of a tail, in my opinion. So I go a little bit under that for the tail, and the thicker clump of hair is useful for the wings, because here the traditional thing to do is to divide those wings. So I'm going to try to stack this in the smaller hair stacker. It goes down. Give it a few taps so that everybody knows you're tying flies, and retrieve it from the stacker. Now pull out anything else that's kind of not in the right place, and measure the length of the shank. Place it in at the tying point and transfer it to the other hand. And now what I'm going to do, in order to get this hair to be where I want it to be, I angle it, so keeping it between my fingers, I angle it down so that when I come with a thread on top of it and I do a soft loop and then I start tightening, what I want is, I want the thread tension to bring the hair right on top of the shank. And then I go back to the tying point, never letting go of the hair, and putting in some really nice tight wraps. So here it pays to learn how hard you can pull on your thread before you break it. And then just trim the hair. And that's the tails. Some people would like to put in a little bit of head cement at this point. So, okay, I'm not using super glue. I'm going to at least give it a little bit of Sally Hansen's. All right, this is all going to get on my fingers now when I get to do the wings. Now I bring my thread to the front, and this is at the front, let's say 66% point on the hook shank. So divide the hook shank in thirds. So this is like 2/3 up front. You don't want the wings to be too far to the front of the fly, because then you're not leaving yourself any room for the hackle. And now I'm going to cut another little clump of calf hair. This time I want a little bit more than what I had for the tails. Because remember, I want enough hair here. So you can see this is a thicker clump. And in fact, if you're careful when you pull the hair, so you grab it between your fingers before you cut it, if you're careful enough, this hardly needs any stacking. The tips are reasonably well aligned, but I will stack it just to be on the safe side. And now the thing is, to make your life easier, you want to pull it out with those tips facing forward, which is the way you're going to be tying this in. Now grab it by the tips, and I'll have to transfer it between fingers a few times to just pull all the nasty bits out. This is also not the cleanest fly tying experience. So again, measure the length of the hook shank. Place your clump in at the tying point. And again, using the same trick with starting with the hair at a bit of a diagonal there. Whoops. Okay, there you go. Broke the thread. Do I have any thread handy? Yes, I have some thread. I'll just switch thread now because I don't want to retie this hair. And then so I just want to make sure that this thing is secure before I put the thread in. Okay, so this is good enough. Usually you can just let go if you tied your hair in sufficiently secure the first time, and if you have enough wraps of thread there, this will hold it. Okay, the other thing you want now to do, and I hope I didn't go too far back, is you want to cut. I'm going to lift the hair here so maybe you can see that. So what you want here is, you can see where the hair for the tails ends and where the hair for the wings ends. And you want to cut this so that the two ends of your hair, after you cut them, they kind of meet each other, so you don't get an uneven shaped body. So you cut this like this, and that gives you a built-in taper, as you can see. And then with the thread, I'm going to be compressing this. And I get a little bit of a taper here because, you know, this is a little thicker. If it's too sharp of a step, you can always add a little bit more thread back here. Okay, and then move to the front. And now you lift the wings up. And there's always a number of small hairs that are going to get in the way here. You just have to pull this back and do a little bit of a thread dam right in front of the wing. This will lift your wing up, and now it's ready for being divided. So what you do is try to, you know, turn the hook in the vise a little bit so you can see better. What I do is I just use my fingertips here and estimate. You know, you can use the tips of your scissors to put them down like this and sort of separate your wings in half. Anyway, you eyeball it, and it does come reasonably close to being half. I'm never sure if it's perfectly half, but it doesn't really matter. Okay, so there's one clump. You figure 8 your thread at the base. And then to get neater wings, this is still a bit of a mess, as you can see. To get neater wings, what you do before we get on to the next step is you're going to post the bases of each of your wings. So just careful here. This is at a slightly awkward angle. Just enough. You don't want to go far. You're not trying. Oof, that was not good. Sometimes your thread slips. Ah. Okay. And then you post the other side. You only want to do enough posting here to hold the hair into 2 distinct halves of the wing. You're not going to wrap hackle up these posts. Okay, so the purpose of the posting here is just to divide the wings properly. And of course, what happens, as always, is because I can't see very well all this white hair, I have a lot of stray hairs. And now is a good time to get rid of this stray hair without cutting the thread if I can. Because once I get to the next steps, this is going to be a lot harder. Make sure that everything is where you want it to be, because you can't change it anymore once you leave this point. Okay, so now we have an upright and divided wing. Hopefully there are no more stray hairs. And the next thing is to put in an abdomen. Now for the abdomen, I have a bunch of prepared stripped peacock quills. Now the way to get these peacock quills, I find, is the following. You take a nice peacock feather and you pull off a bunch of nice hurls. Make sure that they're not broken or anything like that. And soak them in water for a few minutes. Once they're nice and soggy, you get them one at a time, and using a regular eraser, well, a quality eraser. I like these plasticky ones. I think this is a Mars brand. So it's the stuff that actually, you know, you can use it to erase pencil and doesn't leave ugly residue behind. So it's fairly soft. Okay. And you take your peacock quill and you put it down on a smooth surface. If you have a piece of glass, a piece of smooth plastic, you know, anything like that. I have a desk pad that's some kind of smooth plastic. That's pretty good because it, you know, it keeps the water from damaging anything, and it allows me to you just take the eraser and you rub along. So you press with one finger, you keep your peacock herl down, and then you use the eraser to rub. You go against the fiber. This is the most effective way. And it just comes out as some beautifully colored mud off the herl. And then you have to turn it on the other side to get all the little fuzz off. And you know, it actually doesn't take much effort to do this. And once you get going, you'll find you can strip a bunch of herls. Now, depending on the size of your fly, you may not want to start right at the very tip because this is very, very fine stuff. And so for a herl this long, I'm just going to cut this basically in half because all I want to do is tie myself an abdomen. So what I'm going to do is I'll just cut this at about the halfway point. So I'm left with something like this. Now you can use super glue before you tie in your peacock herl, and then you just leave it like that. Or if you don't like to use super glue, which is me, you take a little bit of copper wire for a rib, and this is going to reinforce your abdomen. You just tie this on, go to the end here, let it hang, and take your peacock quill. So now, again, to avoid breaking this, some people say, you know, just soak it in water before you tie. I guess that's one way to do it. The other way, I think that's probably even more important, is watch for the curvature, because these things, they come off a feather. So there is an inside and there is an outside, right? So here it's pretty obvious which way this thing is naturally curved. So I tie it in so that when I wrap it, I don't go against this natural curvature. Okay, so it's basically with the outside of the feather pointing up, what used to be the outside of the feather. Again, hold it at an angle here, so that again, my first wrap is not going to be at too sharp of an angle with the body of the fly. Okay, and then use some kind of hackle plier if you want. And for the first few wraps, you really want to pay attention not to catch the point of the hook. As this stuff, like I said, is fragile, and one touch on the point of the hook and it may just go boing on you. Otherwise, this stuff is nice. It wraps on, it gives a natural segmentation. It's beautiful material for bodies. Okay, you don't want to go too far. We still need to put some fuzzy peacock herl for the thorax. So secure this, cut off. You can see the kind of the naturally segmented look this is giving, and then use the copper wire to counterwind here a rib. That's going to keep your peacock quill secure. You could use some head cement on top of this for extra security if you think necessary. But you know, if your flies last too long, then you run out of excuses for tying more flies. So there's a limit. Okie doke. Now we need some real peacock herl, you know, the pretty stuff. And this is from the eye. It's pretty fine stuff. And this is a large size 10 fly. So I'm gonna take 2 of these. I'm gonna trim the tips. It's always way too fragile to do anything with them. And I'm going to attach those right behind the wing here. And I'm going to move my thread to right the point behind the wing. I may also just at this point tie in my my hackle. So I have furnace hackle is what's called for. But if you just have brown, that's also fine. And let's see if one hackle is enough. Ideally, saddle hackle would be nice, but saddle hackle in size 10, it's very hard to get. So I'm just using what I have. And then move the thread up front. Okay, what I'm gonna do now is I take my peacock herl and start working on the thorax. A few wraps here behind the hackle, and then move. And in this process, you just want to make sure you're not catching hairs from the wing to create a mess. Just go in and build a little thorax. It goes faster if you use hackle pliers, I suppose. And another important thing, of course, is leave yourself about an eye's width of space here on the hook shank, so you can finish off the fly properly. Okay, make sure this is well secured. And now get some hackle pliers and wind this hackle. So if you tie it in right, then you should be able to have the fibers pointing perpendicular to the hook shank. Avoid catching either bits of wing or anything else. Move the, you know, just kind of work your way around the wings. And also to make sure that you're not getting too many of the hackle fibers caught, you can always just keep pulling back on the hackle a little bit as you wind it. Okay. If you're not happy, just back off a little bit and then go back. And when you're run out of hackle, well, you have to stop. I guess I could have probably used the second hackle here. This is fairly sparse. You want this to be as bushy as you can get it. And the answer to that is either to use a longer saddle hackle, which would be nice if you had it. And lacking that, you could use 2 hackles. And then once you reach the end, just do a little bit of a head, couple of whip finishes, and that way you don't need any lacquer or anything like that. And there we are. This is a size 10 house and lot variant. And it's supposed to be a heavy water fly that all that hair certainly helps it float well. And the bushier hackle would help as well. So that's the one thing that I would do probably on the next one. I would probably put a little bit more hackle than this. And that's that. And you're supposed to be able to tie these things in smaller sizes as well. We've done some 12s. I'm going to try 14s and 16s. I'm not sure I want to go much smaller than that. And that's that.
Very nice. Flo.
Time and under budget. It's 11:59.
Well done. That's really nice fly.
Thank you.
So Florin, I guess next week is the long weekend, and there's got a bunch of people away from up at Buttle Lake, so we'll not tie next weekend. But the following week, probably we can do something for Tony on spinning deer hair.
I'm afraid 2 weeks from today I won't be on either.
Oh, you're
We can
gone
walk.
fishing.
Yeah,
that's okay.
that's the plan. Can you stop recording?
Yep. Let me just let's get that done first. Stop.